The envelope felt heavier than it should have in my trembling hands. Just 20 minutes earlier, I'd been unwrapping a dish sponge while my sister-in-law Madison displayed her luxurious spa weekend gift like a trophy. The contrast couldn't have been more humiliating. My husband's family sat around our dining table, their family-first smiles masking what I now realized was calculated cruelty. The Mother's Day gifts told the whole story. Madison received a $1,000 retreat package, complete with massages and gourmet meals, while I got cleaning supplies wrapped in dollar store paper. But this envelope, hidden beneath the tissue paper, contained something that would flip their perfect facade upside down. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story proves that sometimes the most devastating truths hide in plain sight. Madison held up her spa certificate like she'd won the lottery, her perfectly manicured nails catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through our dining room windows. "Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Mom Peterson. This is exactly what I needed after such a stressful month at work." Her voice dripped with practiced gratitude as she leaned over to hug my mother-in-law, who beamed with satisfaction. The room filled with appreciative murmurs from the assembled family members. My husband David sat beside me, his jaw tight with what I thought was embarrassment at the obvious disparity in gifts. I clutched my unwrapped dish sponge, still in its plastic packaging, feeling like a servant who'd accidentally wandered into the wrong celebration. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent 3 days preparing this elaborate Mother's Day brunch. My mother-in-law Eleanor turned to me with that smile I'd learned to fear over the past 8 years of marriage. "And Sarah, darling, I got you something practical. I know how much you love keeping that kitchen spotless." Her tone suggested she was doing me a tremendous favor by acknowledging my existence. The extended family members nodded approvingly, as if receiving cleaning supplies was the height of thoughtfulness for a mother of 3. My youngest daughter, Emma, only 6 years old, looked confused by the adults' reactions. She tugged on my sleeve and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Mommy, why didn't Grandma get you something fun like Aunt Madison?" The table fell silent for a moment before forced laughter erupted, with Eleanor patting Emma's head condescendingly. "Sweet child, your mommy appreciates useful gifts." I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of checking the roast, but really I needed a moment to compose myself before I said something I'd regret. The dish sponge package crinkled in my hands as I set it on the counter next to the expensive ingredients I'd purchased for this gathering. Through the kitchen doorway, I could hear Madison describing her spa weekend in detail, each amenity more luxurious than the last. David's sister Janet chimed in about how Madison deserved such pampering after all her hard work at the marketing firm. Nobody mentioned that I worked full-time as a nurse while managing our household and 3 children. The envelope I discovered tucked beneath the tissue paper sat on the counter, its contents still unknown, but somehow ominous. Something about Eleanor's overly sweet demeanor today felt different, more calculated than her usual passive-aggressive behavior. My fingers traced the envelope's edges as I tried to make sense of the day's events. The paper was expensive, cream-colored with Eleanor's monogrammed return address embossed in gold. Inside, I could feel what seemed to be multiple documents, rather than a simple card or letter. The weight suggested legal papers, which struck me as odd for a Mother's Day gift envelope. Madison's laughter echoed from the dining room, followed by my husband's forced chuckle. 8 years of marriage had taught me to recognize when David was uncomfortable, and his laugh today sounded strained. I'd noticed him having hushed phone conversations with his mother lately, conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. The timing of this family gathering, combined with the unusual generosity toward Madison and the obvious slight toward me, began forming a pattern in my mind that I didn't want to acknowledge. The envelope's flap wasn't sealed, just tucked under, as if Eleanor wanted me to find and open it. My hands shook slightly as I lifted the flap and peered inside. The documents were folded neatly, but I could make out official letterhead and what appeared to be property records. One corner revealed part of our home's address, which sent a chill down my spine. Why would Eleanor have documents related to our house? David and I had purchased this home 5 years ago with his parents' help as co-signers, but we'd been making all the payments ourselves. The sound of chairs scraping against the dining room floor indicated the family was preparing to move to the living room for coffee and dessert. I quickly tucked the envelope into my apron pocket, my mind racing with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Something was happening that involved our home, and I had a sinking feeling it wasn't in my favor. David appeared in the doorway, his face flushed and his eyes avoiding mine. "Sarah, Mom wants to know if you need help with the coffee service." His voice carried an odd formality that we'd never used with each other, even during our worst arguments. I studied his expression, noting the guilt written in the tight lines around his eyes and the way his hands fidgeted with his wedding ring. "I can manage," I replied, testing his reaction. He nodded too quickly and turned to leave, then paused as if he wanted to say something more. The envelope in my pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric. "David," I called softly, making him freeze. "Is there anything you need to tell me about today? About why your mother chose such different gifts for Madison and me?" His shoulders sagged, and for a moment I thought he might confess whatever was weighing on him. "She's always been particular about her gift-giving," he said finally, still not meeting my eyes. "You know how she is about practical versus frivolous spending." But his explanation felt hollow, rehearsed even. I'd witnessed Eleanor spend frivolously on herself and her favorite family members countless times over the years. The woman owned more designer handbags than most boutiques. David's attempt to normalize the situation only confirmed my growing suspicions that something significant was happening beneath the surface. As he left to rejoin the family, I pulled the envelope from my pocket and stared at it. The return address showed Eleanor's lawyer's office, not her personal residence. Legal documents delivered as a Mother's Day surprise could only mean trouble. My nursing training had taught me to trust my instincts when something felt wrong, and every instinct was screaming warnings right now. The coffee service took longer than necessary as I tried to delay returning to the family gathering. Each cup I filled, each sugar spoon I placed, bought me time to process what was happening. Through the pass-through window, I watched Eleanor holding court in the living room, her gestures animated as she described some upcoming family vacation that Madison would apparently be joining. The conversation stopped when I entered with the coffee tray. Eleanor's smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sarah, dear, would you mind taking some photos of the family? I want to capture this special Mother's Day." She handed me her expensive camera, effectively removing me from any family pictures while positioning me as the hired help. Madison immediately moved to sit beside David on the couch, her spa certificate still in her hands like a prop. The symbolism wasn't subtle. I took the requested photos, watching through the viewfinder as Eleanor arranged everyone in what looked like a family portrait, minus one member: me. David looked increasingly uncomfortable as his mother directed him to sit closer to Madison, to smile bigger, to hold up Madison's gift certificate for the camera. "This will be perfect for the family newsletter," Eleanor announced, referring to the quarterly update she sent to relatives across the country. My children were included in the photos, but positioned as if they were Madison's rather than mine. Emma kept looking toward the kitchen where I stood, confusion clear on her little face. The envelope in my pocket seemed to grow heavier with each staged photograph. These weren't candid Mother's Day memories being captured. They were documentation of something else entirely. Eleanor was creating evidence of a family structure that didn't include me. After the photo session, Eleanor suggested that David and Madison take a walk around the neighborhood to catch up on old times. They'd grown up in this area together, she explained to the room, back when things were simpler. The not-so-subtle implication that my presence had complicated things hung in the air. David hesitated, glancing at me as if seeking permission, but Eleanor's expectant gaze won out. As they left through the front door, Madison's hand brushed against David's arm in a gesture that seemed more intimate than sisterly. I began clearing the coffee cups with mechanical precision, my mind replaying every interaction I'd witnessed today. The expensive gifts, the photo positioning, the deliberate exclusion, and now the private walk. Each element suggested a campaign to rewrite our family narrative. The envelope in my pocket contained the final piece of this puzzle. My mother-in-law settled into her favorite armchair with a satisfied sigh, watching me clean up the aftermath of her carefully orchestrated gathering. "Sarah, darling, you've done such a lovely job today." The food was adequate, and the service was perfectly efficient. Her backhanded compliments had lost their sting over the years, but today they felt particularly sharp. I continued collecting plates and glasses, using the mundane task to keep my hands busy while my mind processed the day's events. Eleanor's eyes followed my movements like a predator watching prey. "I do hope you're taking good care of yourself," she continued with false concern. "These family gatherings can be so overwhelming for some people. Perhaps you should consider whether hosting duties are too much for someone in your position." Her words carried an undertone that suggested she knew something I didn't. The envelope opened easily, revealing a stack of legal documents. The top page was a property deed transfer form, with our partially visible address blurred in visuals at the top. My eyes scanned the document, catching phrases about ownership changes and financial arrangements. Eleanor watched my face intently as I read, clearly savoring my growing confusion and alarm. "You see, dear," she began in her most patronizing tone, "when David and I co-signed for this house, we made certain legal arrangements to protect the family's interests. The mortgage company required specific provisions given David's employment situation at the time." I flipped to the next page, finding what appeared to be a car title transfer document for David's vehicle. My husband's name was being removed, replaced with Madison's signature. The third document hit me like a physical blow. It was a college fund transfer form, moving our children's education savings into an account with Madison listed as the primary beneficiary. $18,000 that David and I had scraped together over the years, often sacrificing our own needs to ensure our kids could attend college. Now Madison's name was on the signature line, with Eleanor listed as the secondary account holder. "I don't understand," I whispered, though the picture was becoming horrifyingly clear. Eleanor leaned forward in her chair, her voice taking on the patient tone one might use with a confused child. "Well, dear, since Madison is going to be taking over your responsibilities, it only makes sense that she would need access to these assets. The house, the car, the children's future, everything needs to be properly transferred to ensure continuity." Her words barely penetrated the roaring in my ears as the full scope of their deception became apparent. "Taking over my responsibilities?" The words came out as a croak, my throat suddenly dry as desert sand. Eleanor nodded as if we were discussing the weather rather than the systematic dismantling of my life. "Oh yes, didn't David mention? He and Madison have been spending quite a bit of time together lately, rekindling their old connection. It turns out they realized what they really had was much deeper than either of them originally understood. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. My husband was leaving me for his sister-in-law, and his mother was facilitating the transition by legally transferring our assets to the other woman. The dish sponge, the family photos, the private walk. Every element of today had been designed to establish this new reality. I was being erased from my own family with the efficiency of a corporate restructuring. Eleanor continued her explanation with the detached professionalism of a business consultant. The asset transfers were actually quite straightforward since I remained on various accounts as a co-signer. David's cooperation made the process smooth, and Madison's involvement ensures continuity. The college fund will ensure the children's education remains secure under Madison's guidance. Her use of corporate language to describe the destruction of my family was almost surreal. I stared at the documents, noting that most of the signatures and stamps were blurred in place. Only a few blank lines remained, presumably waiting for my compliance or cooperation. The realization that this deception had been planned and executed over weeks or months made my stomach churn. Every family dinner, every phone call, every seemingly innocent conversation had been part of this elaborate scheme. The sound of the front door opening announced David and Madison's return from their walk. Their voices carried a lightness that seemed obscene given what I'd just learned. Eleanor's timing was perfect, I realized. She'd waited until they returned to force this confrontation, ensuring maximum impact and witnesses to whatever came next. David appeared in the living room doorway, his arm casually draped around Madison's shoulders in a gesture that would have seemed innocent yesterday, but now looked like a public declaration. Madison's cheeks were flushed from their walk, and she carried herself with a confidence that suggested she knew exactly what was waiting for me in that envelope. "Did you share the news with Sarah?" Madison asked Eleanor, her voice bright with anticipation. The casual way she referred to destroying my marriage as news revealed the depth of their callousness. David finally met my eyes, and I saw guilt mixed with defiance in his expression. "Sarah," I know this is sudden, but Madison and I have realized that we have something special. We tried to deny it, but feelings developed that we couldn't ignore. His rehearsed speech sounded like dialogue from a bad soap opera. I looked at the documents in my lap, then back at the three people who had systematically planned my life's destruction. "And the legal documents?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "When exactly did you all decide to transfer my home, my husband's car, and my children's college fund to Madison?" The directness of my question seemed to catch them off guard. Eleanor recovered first, her smile never wavering. "Well, dear, practically speaking, these assets need to be properly managed. Madison has always been so responsible with finances, and since she'll be taking over your role—" She didn't finish the sentence, letting the implication hang. I stood up slowly, the documents still in my hands, and walked to the dining room table where the remnants of our Mother's Day brunch still sat. The expensive ingredients I'd purchased, the hours of preparation, the careful presentation, all of it had been a backdrop for my public humiliation. I spread the legal documents across the table next to the abandoned dish sponge, creating a tableau that perfectly captured the day's true purpose. "So let me understand this correctly," I said, my nurse's training helping me organize the facts despite my emotional turmoil. "You planned this entire gathering to inform me that my husband is leaving me for his sister-in-law, and you've already begun transferring our marital assets to facilitate this transition. The gifts today were symbolic. Madison gets luxury and relaxation, while I get cleaning supplies, representing my new role as the discarded wife who should quietly disappear." Eleanor clapped her hands together as if I'd solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "Oh, good, you do understand. I was worried this might be too complex for you to grasp quickly." Her condescending approval made my skin crawl. David shifted uncomfortably, perhaps finally recognizing how his participation appeared from my perspective. Madison, however, seemed energized by my understanding. "Sarah, I want you to know this isn't about you personally. David and I have just discovered something meaningful together, and it would be wrong to deny that connection because of conventional expectations." Her attempt to frame adultery and betrayal as some kind of spiritual awakening was breathtaking in its audacity. The three of them stood there waiting for my response, clearly expecting me to accept their narrative and cooperate with their legal arrangements. They'd underestimated the wrong woman. I picked up the dish sponge from the table and examined it thoughtfully, letting the silence stretch until the tension in the room became palpable. "You know what's interesting about this particular gift?" I asked, addressing Eleanor directly. "A dish sponge is designed to absorb mess and clean up after other people's carelessness. You chose it because you see me as someone who exists to handle the unpleasant cleanup while others enjoy the benefits." I set the sponge down and picked up the legal documents. "But what's really fascinating is how thoroughly you've documented your arrangement. Property transfers, asset reassignments, beneficiary changes, all signed and dated, creating a perfect paper trail of questionable activity." Eleanor's smile faltered slightly. "Now, dear, there's no need for such dramatic language. These are all perfectly legitimate transfers between consenting family members." Her defensive tone suggested she hadn't expected me to analyze the situation so clinically. "Legitimate transfers require informed consent from all parties," I replied, my professional knowledge of documentation serving me well. "These documents show systematic planning to deceive a spouse regarding marital assets. The timing, the coordination, the deliberate concealment, it's concerning behavior." David stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Sarah, please don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. We can work something out that's fair for everyone." His definition of fair apparently involved me losing everything while he started fresh with his new love and my hard-earned assets. Madison moved closer to David, her hand possessively gripping his arm. "We're not trying to hurt anyone. We just want to be together, and practical matters need to be handled responsibly." The way she spoke about dismantling my family as mere practical matters revealed her complete lack of empathy or conscience. I walked to the kitchen and returned with my purse, extracting my phone with deliberate precision. "You know what else needs to be handled responsibly? Proper documentation of questionable transfers and infidelity for divorce proceedings." I began photographing each legal document, making sure to capture Eleanor's signature as witness and David's obvious cooperation in the scheme. "Sarah, what are you doing?" David asked, panic creeping into his voice. "I'm protecting my interests the same way you've been protecting yours," I replied calmly. "The difference is that I'm doing it legally and ethically." Eleanor stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "You can't seriously be considering making this public. Think of the family reputation, the children's future, the social embarrassment." Her concern for appearances over morality was typical Eleanor, but her desperation suggested she understood the legal vulnerability they'd created. "The children's future?" I repeated, holding up the college fund transfer document. "You mean the future you've compromised by giving their education money to your son's affair partner?" The harsh words hung in the air like a slap. Madison flinched, apparently preferring euphemisms to accurate descriptions of her role in this situation. "That's unnecessarily harsh," she said, her voice quavering slightly. "David and I have a genuine connection that goes beyond conventional boundaries." I laughed, a sound that surprised even me with its bitterness. "Genuine connections don't require secret legal schemes and identity manipulation. They also don't typically involve taking college funds from children." David finally found his voice, though it cracked with the strain of his collapsing facade. "Sarah, I never meant for it to happen this way. Madison and I developed feelings that complicated our marriage, but sometimes emotions override everything else." His unrealistic expectations were almost pitiable. "Emotions don't override property law," I replied, continuing to photograph the documents from every angle. "And they certainly don't excuse questionable financial transfers. You've all created enough evidence to support serious legal consequences, not just civil divorce proceedings." The flash from my phone camera seemed to illuminate more than just the paperwork. It exposed the complete moral bankruptcy of their scheme. Eleanor sank back into her chair, apparently realizing that her carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling faster than she could control. "Surely we can reach some kind of understanding," she said, her imperious tone replaced by something approaching pleading. "Family matters should be handled privately, with dignity and discretion." I looked around at the three people who had conspired against me while maintaining facades of love and concern. "You should have considered dignity and discretion before planning your elaborate deception during a Mother's Day celebration." The doorbell rang, interrupting our tense standoff with its cheerful chime. Eleanor, David, and Madison exchanged worried glances, clearly not expecting additional guests. I felt a spark of hope, remembering that my sister Linda had mentioned stopping by later to see how the family gathering had gone. "That's probably my sister," I said, noting how the three conspirators seemed to deflate at this news. Linda worked as a paralegal for one of the city's most respected family law firms, and her expertise in matrimonial cases would be invaluable right now. "Should I invite her in to examine these interesting legal documents?" I asked, enjoying the panic that flickered across Eleanor's face. David moved toward the door as if to intercept Linda, but I was faster. "Actually, David, I think Linda would be very interested in how you've been handling our marital assets lately." Linda entered with her usual warm smile, carrying a beautiful bouquet of flowers and a wrapped gift. "Happy Mother's Day, Sarah. I hope the family gathering went well." Her genuine affection was a stark contrast to the calculated manipulation I'd endured all day. She paused, noting the tension in the room and the legal documents spread across the dining table. "Is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor attempted to regain control of the situation, standing and extending her hand to Linda with forced hospitality. "Linda, how lovely to see you. We were just having a family discussion about some boring paperwork. Nothing that would interest someone outside the immediate family." Her dismissive tone and attempt to exclude Linda from the conversation was a tactical error. Linda had never liked Eleanor's condescending attitude, and the obvious tension in the room immediately put her on high alert. "Actually," I said, picking up the property deed transfer document, "I think Linda would find this paperwork very interesting, especially the parts about transferring marital assets without spousal notification." Linda's expression shifted from social pleasantries to professional concern as she recognized the legal implications. She moved to the table and began examining the documents with the trained eye of someone who'd seen similar cases many times before. "Sarah, are these what I think they are?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Eleanor attempted to intervene, moving between Linda and the table. Now see here, these are private family documents that don't concern outsiders. Linda's response was polite, but firm. Actually, attempted transfer of marital property without spousal consent is a serious legal matter that concerns anyone with knowledge of matrimonial law. May I continue examining these documents? David finally spoke up, his voice strained with obvious stress. Linda, this is all just a misunderstanding. Sarah is overreacting to some routine paperwork. But Linda was already photographing the documents with her own phone, her paralegal training, ensuring she captured all relevant signatures and dates. Routine paperwork doesn't typically involve transferring house deeds, car titles, and college funds to third parties without proper legal representation for all affected parties, she observed. Madison attempted damage control with a different approach. We're all family here. David and I are simply trying to handle some complex financial arrangements responsibly. Linda looked up from the documents with the kind of expression she usually reserved for particularly dishonest opposing counsel. Complex financial arrangements typically require full disclosure and consent from all parties, especially spouses. These documents show systematic concealment and questionable activity. Eleanor made one last attempt to regain control of the narrative. This is becoming unnecessarily dramatic. Families rearrange their financial structures all the time for tax purposes and estate planning. Linda's response was swift and professional. Estate planning doesn't involve adultery, asset concealment, or misappropriation of children's college funds. What I'm seeing here represents serious legal violations disguised as family financial planning. The legal terminology hung in the air like a death sentence for their scheme. David's face had gone pale, apparently finally understanding the serious implications of their actions. Madison looked between Eleanor and David as if expecting one of them to produce a magic solution to their rapidly deteriorating situation. But we haven't actually done anything wrong yet, she said desperately. These are just proposed transfers that haven't been completed. Linda examined the signatures and dates on the documents more carefully. Actually, several of these transfers show completed signatures from recent days, Linda observed, pointing to specific sections of the paperwork. These documents were executed over recent days before this gathering. Her revelations stunned me into silence. While I'd been preparing this Mother's Day brunch in good faith, they'd been systematically transferring everything I'd worked for. David's guilt finally overwhelmed his attempts at justification. Sarah, I can explain everything. The transfers were just precautionary measures in case our relationship couldn't be saved. I never intended for you to be hurt or left with nothing. His explanation only made their deception more calculated and cruel. They'd planned for every contingency except the possibility that I might discover their scheme and fight back. Linda continued her examination of the documents, her professional composure masking what I knew was growing outrage on my behalf. These recently executed documents indicate coordinated planning rather than spontaneous decision-making, suggesting serious intent to deceive. Eleanor attempted one final manipulation, appealing to Linda directly. Surely, as a professional, you understand that families sometimes need to make difficult financial decisions during periods of transition. This doesn't need to become a legal situation that hurts everyone involved. But Linda had seen too many cases of financial abuse to be swayed by Eleanor's appeals to discretion. Professional ethics require me to advise Mrs. Peterson that she's the victim of questionable transfers and asset manipulation. These represent serious legal violations, not family disagreements. The weight of Linda's words settled over the room like a funeral shroud. David slumped onto the couch, finally grasping that their romantic adventure had become a serious legal situation. Madison looked toward the door as if considering escape, but realized that fleeing would only worsen her legal situation. Eleanor maintained her defiant posture, but I could see fear creeping into her eyes as she contemplated the social and legal consequences of her actions. So, what happens now? I asked Linda, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Now we document everything, secure copies of all questionable transfers, and contact both law enforcement and your divorce attorney. Time is critical to reverse these transfers before additional assets disappear. Her professional efficiency was comforting after the emotional manipulation I'd endured all day. I gathered the scattered legal documents into a neat pile, each paper representing another layer of betrayal I'd uncovered in the span of an hour. David, I said, addressing my husband directly for what I realized might be the last time. Did you really think I would just accept this? That I would quietly disappear so you could start fresh with Madison and my life's work? He met my eyes briefly before looking away, unable to maintain contact with the woman he'd systematically betrayed. I thought maybe, if you understood how serious Madison and I were about each other, you might be willing to work with us on a reasonable settlement. His definition of reasonable apparently involved me losing everything while they kept all our assets. Eleanor stood up abruptly, her composure finally completely shattered. This has gone far enough. David, Madison, we're leaving now before this gets any more out of hand. But Linda stepped toward the door, her paralegal authority surprising everyone in the room. Actually, I need to advise all parties that leaving now could complicate prosecution efforts. Mrs. Peterson has the right to secure these premises and prevent removal of any additional assets until proper legal representation can be arranged. Eleanor's face flushed red with indignation. You have no authority to detain us in our own family member's home. But Linda's response was calm and professionally devastating. This home was transferred without Mrs. Peterson's knowledge or consent. The legitimacy of current ownership is questionable until these transfers can be properly reviewed and reversed. The implications of Linda's statement hit David like a physical blow. His romantic escape plan was becoming a legal nightmare with every passing minute. Madison finally broke her silence with a desperate appeal that revealed the depth of her delusion. Sarah, please try to understand. David and I never meant to hurt you. We just fell in love. And love sometimes requires difficult choices. I looked at this woman who had sat at my table, eaten food I'd prepared, accepted my hospitality, all while systematically undermining my life. Madison, love doesn't require deception. It doesn't demand questionable transfers or arrangement. What you and David have isn't love. It's mutual selfishness enabled by unethical behavior. My words seemed to penetrate her romantic fantasies for the first time, and she flinched as if I'd struck her. Eleanor made one last attempt to salvage their scheme. Sarah, surely we can negotiate some kind of settlement that works for everyone. Dragging this through the courts will be expensive and traumatic for the children. The children whose college fund you transferred? I replied, holding up the beneficiary transfer document. You should have considered their trauma before planning this elaborate deception. Linda had been quietly photographing additional evidence while we talked, and now she looked up with grim satisfaction. I have enough documentation to support serious charges and emergency injunctions to freeze all asset transfers. Mrs. Peterson, would you like me to contact law enforcement now, or would you prefer to speak with a divorce attorney first? The question hung in the air like a sword over the heads of my betrayers. David finally found his voice, though it cracked with desperation. Sarah, please don't destroy our family over this. Think about Emma, Michael, and Jason. They need stability, not a legal war between their parents. His appeal to our children's welfare was particularly inappropriate, coming from the man who just transferred their college education. I am thinking about our children, I replied firmly. I'm thinking about the lesson they'll learn if I allow their father and grandmother to commit questionable acts against their mother without consequences. I'm thinking about the college education you just gave away to fund your relationship crisis. David's face crumpled as the full weight of his actions finally registered. Madison moved closer to him. Whether for comfort or protection, I couldn't tell. Eleanor maintained her defiant stance, but her hands shook as she clutched her purse like a shield. Linda finished her documentation and looked at me expectantly. The evidence is clear and overwhelming. These people have engaged in serious violations while creating perfect documentation of their actions. What would you like me to do first? Her professional confidence gave me strength to face the hardest decision of my marriage. I walked to the window and looked out at the neighborhood where David and Madison had taken their romantic stroll while I discovered their betrayal. The irony of their timing wasn't lost on me. They'd celebrated their plan while I uncovered the evidence that would expose them. Linda, please contact your firm's referral attorney and schedule an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. Also, contact law enforcement to file reports for the questionable transfers and asset manipulation. I want every available legal remedy pursued to the fullest extent. Eleanor gasped as if I'd announced a death sentence. Sarah, you can't be serious. The family reputation, the social consequences, the children's future, you're destroying everything over a simple misunderstanding. Her characterization of systematic deception as a simple misunderstanding perfectly captured her complete disconnect from reality and basic morality. The family reputation was damaged when you planned this arrangement, I replied calmly. The social consequences began when David chose infidelity over honesty. The children's future was harmed when you transferred their college fund. I'm not destroying anything. I'm simply documenting and addressing the destruction you've already caused. David made one final plea that revealed his complete lack of understanding about accountability. Sarah, if you pursue this legally, I could face serious consequences. Madison could face charges. Mom could lose her reputation in the community. Is your anger really worth destroying so many lives? His question was breathtaking in its moral blindness. They'd systematically destroyed my life while maintaining facades of love and family loyalty. But somehow my response to their actions was the destructive force. Linda packed the last of the evidence into her briefcase with professional efficiency. Mrs. Peterson, I'll need you to come to the office tomorrow at 9 a.m. to meet with our attorney and begin preparing the divorce paperwork. Tonight, I recommend changing all passwords, securing any remaining joint accounts, and documenting any additional assets they might attempt to transfer. Eleanor made one last desperate appeal. Linda, surely as a professional you understand that families sometimes have disputes that shouldn't involve the legal system. Can't this be handled privately through civil court? But Linda's response ended Eleanor's hopes for containing their exposure. Asset manipulation and questionable transfers are serious matters regardless of family relationships. The legal system doesn't ignore violations just because perpetrators are related to their victims. The finality in her voice left no room for negotiation or compromise. The front door opened, and my 3 children came home from their afternoon with friends, their innocent chatter a stark contrast to the plan that had been unfolding in their absence. Emma ran to me with her usual enthusiasm, while Michael and Jason, now teenagers, immediately sensed the tension in the room. "Mom, what's wrong?" Michael asked, his protective instincts already developing at 15. I knelt down to Emma's level, choosing my words carefully. "Daddy and Grandma Eleanor made some very poor choices today, and now we need to address the problems they created." Jason, at 13, was old enough to understand complex family issues. "What kind of poor choices?" he asked, his eyes darting between his father and grandmother with growing suspicion. The moment of truth had arrived sooner than I'd planned. "They tried to give our house, Daddy's car, and your college money to Aunt Madison without telling me," I explained as simply as possible. Emma's confusion was immediate and vocal. "Why would they give our stuff to Aunt Madison? That's not fair." Her innocent outrage perfectly captured the moral clarity that the adults had abandoned. Michael's face darkened as he processed the implications. "Dad, you gave away our college fund, the money you said was for our future?" David's shame was written across his features as he faced his children's bewilderment and disappointment. "It's complicated, son. Adults sometimes have to make difficult financial decisions during relationship changes." His euphemistic explanation fooled no one, especially his increasingly upset teenage sons, who were old enough to recognize betrayal when they saw it. Linda stepped forward, her professional demeanor softening as she addressed the children. "Your mom is making sure that your college money and your home are protected legally. Sometimes adults make mistakes that require legal correction." Eleanor attempted to interrupt, but Linda's firm gesture silenced her. "Mrs. Peterson, your interference has caused enough damage for one day." Jason looked directly at his grandmother with an expression that would have withered flowers. "Grandma Eleanor, why did you try to take our college money? Mom and Dad worked really hard to save that for us." Eleanor's attempt to maintain her facade crumbled under her grandson's direct question. "Oh, sweetheart, it wasn't taking anything. Aunt Madison was just going to help manage your education funds more efficiently." Even the children could recognize the absurdity of her explanation. Emma tugged on my sleeve with the directness that only 6-year-olds possess. "Mommy, are we going to be poor now? Are we going to lose our house?" Her innocent questions cut through all the legal complexities to the heart of what mattered most. "No, sweetheart. The lawyers are going to make sure that Daddy and Grandma Eleanor give back everything they tried to take away. Our house will stay ours, and your college money will be protected." Linda nodded in agreement. The legal system has ways to reverse questionable transfers and protect families from this kind of financial manipulation. Your mother is being very smart by documenting everything properly. Michael crossed his arms and stared at his father with obvious disappointment. "Dad, how could you do this to Mom and us? She worked so hard, and we trusted you." The pain in his voice was heartbreaking. David's attempts to explain his actions to his children were pathetic and revealing. Sometimes adults develop feelings in ways that complicate existing arrangements. Madison and I discovered emotions that we couldn't ignore, and we tried to handle the practical aspects responsibly. Jason's response was swift and cutting. "Responsibly? You transferred our college money and tried to give our house away. How is that responsible?" Even at 13, he could see through his father's self-serving justifications. Eleanor attempted to regain control by addressing the children directly. "Your father and Aunt Madison have found happiness together, and sometimes happiness requires adults to reorganize their priorities and resources." Emma looked at her grandmother with the kind of innocence that reveals truth. "But Aunt Madison isn't our mom. Why would she get our stuff?" The question revealed the fundamental unfairness of their arrangement. Linda checked her watch and indicated that we needed to leave for her office while the evidence was still fresh and the perpetrators were still accessible. "Sarah, we should go now to begin the formal legal process. The sooner we file charges and injunctions, the better chance we have of recovering all transferred assets." Eleanor made one final, desperate attempt to prevent our departure. "Sarah, please reconsider this course of action. Think of the children, the family stability, the public embarrassment. Surely we can work something out privately." But I'd heard enough empty appeals to family loyalty from people who'd systematically betrayed that very concept. "Eleanor, you should have thought about family stability before planning this deception. You should have considered the children before transferring their college fund. You forfeited any right to private negotiations when you chose deception over honesty." As we prepared to leave, Madison made her own pathetic appeal. "Sarah, I know you're angry, but please don't let your emotions destroy David's future. He's a good man who made a mistake in trying to follow his heart." Her characterization of systematic deception as following his heart was breathtakingly delusional. "Madison, good men don't commit questionable transfers against their wives. They don't take their children's college funds to impress their affair partners. David stopped being a good man when he signed those transfer documents." Linda had been quietly observing the family dynamics, and now she spoke with professional authority. "Mrs. Peterson has been remarkably restrained in her response to systematic financial manipulation. Many people in her situation would have called police immediately rather than attempting to understand the scope of the betrayal. Her validation of my measured response felt like a lifeline. David made one last attempt to appeal to our shared history. "Sarah, please remember the good years we had together. Remember the love we shared, the family we built, the dreams we pursued. Don't let this one mistake destroy everything we created together." His selective memory was astounding in its dishonesty. "David, you destroyed everything we created when you decided to transfer our assets for your affair. You destroyed our family when you chose deception over honest conversation. I'm simply documenting and addressing the destruction you've already caused." Linda placed her hand on my shoulder supportively. "Mrs. Peterson has the right to pursue full legal remedies for the violations committed against her and her children. Romantic feelings don't provide immunity from asset manipulation prosecution." Her professional backing gave me strength to face what would undoubtedly be a difficult legal battle. Eleanor played her final card, appealing to my children directly in a last desperate attempt to manipulate the situation. "Children, please help your mother understand that families sometimes need to make difficult changes. Your father and Aunt Madison have found something special together, and fighting it will only create more pain for everyone." But Emma's response revealed how completely Eleanor had misjudged the situation. "Grandma Eleanor, you tried to take our house. That's not what family does." Michael and Jason nodded in agreement, their loyalty clearly aligned with the parent who'd been victimized rather than the adults who'd perpetrated the violations. Eleanor's face crumpled as she realized that even her grandchildren could see through her manipulative justifications. Her carefully constructed narrative had collapsed under the moral clarity of children who understood right from wrong. As Linda and I finally left for her law office, I took my children with me, refusing to leave them alone with the people who just demonstrated their willingness to commit violations for personal gain. David called after us desperately. "Sarah, please don't take the kids. They need stability during this difficult transition." His concern for the children's stability was laughably hypocritical, coming from the man who just transferred their college fund and tried to give away their home. "The children need protection from adults who engage in questionable behavior," I replied, without looking back. "Their stability was destroyed when you chose violations over family loyalty." Linda opened her car doors for all of us, her professional competence a welcome contrast to the moral chaos we were leaving behind. As we drove away, I could see Eleanor, David, and Madison standing in our driveway, finally grasping that their perfect scheme had become their perfect downfall. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and devastating for the conspirators. Linda's documentation proved so comprehensive that the district attorney's office immediately filed charges for asset manipulation, questionable transfers, and financial violations. The attorney she'd contacted specialized in financial crimes and was fascinated by the thoroughness of the evidence the perpetrators had created. "In 30 years of practice, I've never seen defendants document their own violations so completely," he told me during our first meeting. "They've essentially built the case for us." David's attempts to negotiate settlements were rejected due to the premeditated nature of the violations and the vulnerability of the victims. Eleanor faced additional charges for arrangement and elder financial manipulation due to her role in orchestrating the scheme. Madison's participation in the deception cost her more than just legal consequences. Her employer, a prestigious marketing firm, terminated her employment when the charges became public record. Professional licenses and certifications were suspended pending resolution of the cases. David faced similar professional consequences as word of his violations spread through his industry. Eleanor's social standing in the community, which she'd valued above all else, was utterly destroyed when local newspapers covered the unusual case of family financial manipulation. The irony wasn't lost on me that their attempts to privately reorganize our family had resulted in very public humiliation for all the conspirators. They'd chosen short-term gratification over long-term consequences and now faced years of legal proceedings and social exile. The asset recovery process was remarkably efficient, thanks to the detailed documentation of questionable transfers. Emergency court injunctions froze all suspicious transactions within 48 hours of filing. The house deed transfer was reversed, restoring my ownership and removing Madison's claim. David's car title was returned to his name, though it remained secured as a marital asset pending divorce proceedings. Most importantly, the children's college fund was fully recovered with additional penalties assessed against the conspirators for misappropriation of minors' assets. Linda's expertise ensured that every dollar was accounted for and protected from future interference. The legal system's swift response sent a clear message that financial manipulation within families would not be tolerated regardless of the relationships involved. 6 months later, the proceedings concluded with convictions on all counts. David received 18 months of legal consequences for asset manipulation and questionable transfers, with additional probation for the college fund misappropriation. Eleanor was sentenced to 12 months for deception and financial manipulation, though her age and health issues might reduce her actual consequences. Madison received the harshest sentence, 24 months, due to her willing participation in violations against children and her complete lack of remorse during proceedings. Their romantic fantasy had cost them their freedom, their reputations, and their financial security. The house they'd tried to take remained mine. The car they'd questionably transferred stayed in David's name, but under court control. And the college fund they'd misappropriated was restored with interest penalties they'd have to pay. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly straightforward, given the convictions for financial manipulation. David's questionable attempts to transfer marital assets were used as evidence of his unfitness as a financial partner and parent. Full custody of the children was awarded to me, with David's visitation rights severely limited due to his legal record and poor judgment. The property settlement heavily favored me as compensation for the financial violations and betrayal. Eleanor's assets were partially seized to pay restitution for her role in the deception. Madison faced civil lawsuits in addition to her consequences, ensuring that her financial obligations would extend far beyond her sentence. Their attempt to reorganize our family through violations had instead resulted in the complete legal dismantling of their own lives. 1 year after that devastating Mother's Day, my children and I had rebuilt our lives stronger than before. Emma still occasionally asked about why Daddy and Grandma Eleanor had tried to take our stuff, but she'd adjusted well to our new normal with the resilience that children possess. Michael and Jason had learned valuable lessons about integrity, consequences, and standing up to authority figures who abuse their power. Their college funds were not only restored, but had grown substantially due to the penalties assessed against their father and grandmother. The house that had been questionably transferred remained our sanctuary, now free from the toxic influence of Eleanor's manipulative presence. David's legal consequences had initially saddened the children, but they'd come to understand that actions have results, even for parents. The dish sponge that had started this whole revelation sat in a place of honor on my kitchen windowsill, a daily reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything through others' greed and betrayal. Eleanor's intended insult had become my symbol of survival and justice. Every morning when I saw it, I remembered the moment I'd chosen to fight back rather than absorb their abuse silently. Linda had framed her favorite photo from the case, the image of legal documents scattered next to the pathetic dish sponge gift, as a reminder that evidence and preparation can overcome even the most elaborate schemes. The contrast between what they'd tried to give me and what they'd tried to take had perfectly captured the moral bankruptcy of their plan. My nursing colleagues had followed the case with fascination and support, many recognizing similar patterns of financial manipulation in their own patients' families. The case had become something of a legend in our hospital, illustrating how systematic documentation and professional legal help could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Linda's law firm used our case as a training example for new paralegals, showing how thorough evidence collection and swift legal action could protect victims and hold perpetrators accountable. The story had spread through professional networks as an example of how financial predators could be defeated when their victims refused to remain silent. Even Eleanor's former social circle had quietly reached out to express their horror at her actions and support for my courage in pursuing justice. The transformation in my children was perhaps the most rewarding outcome of the entire ordeal. They'd learned that adults sometimes make terrible choices, but that consequences exist to protect innocent people from those choices. Emma had developed a strong sense of fairness and justice, often citing our experience when playground conflicts arose. Michael had chosen criminal justice as his intended college major, inspired by seeing the legal system protect his family from financial predators. Jason had become fiercely protective of family assets and suspicious of adults who made promises they couldn't or wouldn't keep. Their resilience and moral clarity had emerged stronger from witnessing both their father's betrayal and their mother's successful fight for justice. They understood that families are built on trust, not blood relations or shared names. Today, as I prepared for my second Mother's Day since that devastating revelation, I reflected on how completely our lives had changed. The expensive ingredients spread across my kitchen counter were purchased with money that rightfully belonged to me, not taken through deception. My children helped prepare the meal with enthusiasm rather than obligation, understanding that family celebrations should bring joy rather than humiliation. The legal documents that had once threatened our security now sat safely in my attorney's files, serving as permanent reminders of justice served and violations addressed. Eleanor, David, and Madison faced years of legal and social consequences for their choices, while my children and I moved forward with clear consciences and secure futures. The dish sponge still held its place of honor, no longer a symbol of intended degradation, but a testament to survival, justice, and the power of refusing to accept abuse silently. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals create opportunities for the strongest comebacks, and Mother's Day had become our annual celebration of justice served and family protected.